My name is Matt. I'm an engineering team lead for Web API Gateway at Bloomberg. I've been at Bloomberg about 6 years, working on Web APIs the whole time. And before that, a few years before that, I was working at a media company and started using Web APIs when we decided we wanted to decouple our CMS from our front end. So probably about 8 years in the OpenAPI world. At Bloomberg, our team manages all the technology and the standards for RESTful APIs. And together with the Graph API team, we make up API platform. So I want to talk to you today about our journey over the last 6 or 7 years to build and grow our Web API program. I'm going to share a narrative, and we'll come back a few times to some principles that have guided us in the process. And I want to talk about how we've evolved in the way we use specifications and standards to build better APIs, because this is the API specification conference. So I don't think there's anything unique or groundbreaking here. I've heard a lot of echoes of the lessons we've learned in other presentations and conversations over the last couple of days. But I know that over the last few years, I've learned a lot from people sharing this kind of story at this conference. So I'm hoping this can be helpful to you. So, if you're familiar with Bloomberg, you might know we have a cable channel. You might have seen the Bloomberg terminal on trading floors and TV shows and news reports about Wall Street. The Bloomberg terminal delivers this diverse array of financial information to these financial decision makers. At our core, we're a financial data company. But more and more clients want their data delivered not via this terminal to individual traders, but via API to enterprise information systems. Does anybody else have that business need? So that's where our team comes in. Delivering data directly to our client systems isn't new for Bloomberg, but it used to have a bunch of technical hurdles to get past. Proprietary technology, private network lines, custom integration consulting. But Web API Gateway, as we all know here, started with this vision. If we offer our data over the internet using open standards and web technologies, we could unlock new market opportunities and make our data more accessible to many more customers. So in 2015, 2016, we built Web API Gateway. We knew at the time we wanted to prevent duplication in the code of our backend services, so our architecture centralized all the common features we knew that needed in the gateway. Authentication, authorization, monitoring, alerting, logging, routing to backend services, all in one place, which is one of the first principles I want to keep coming back to. Don't repeat yourself. Thank you, Pragmatic Programming. For our team, over the last 6 years, applying DRY has often meant building logic in one way, building logic once in a way that dozens of teams can reuse it. And that ties closely to my other principle for the talk, which is let's make doing the right things easy and the wrong things hard, which best I can tell is a variation on something that Alan Kay and Larry Wall have said. So hard to source the exact thing. Yeah, what's easier than not doing something because it's already taken care of for you? Usually guides our thinking. After the gateway, we built a client portal for onboarding, documentation, configuration, a lot more functions that all should live in one place and didn't need to be duplicated by every team that wanted to offer an API product. And from the beginning, we leveraged OpenAPI specifications, Swagger, for client-facing documentation, and we adopted an open source viewer into our portal. And then we built our first client-facing Web API. Web API Gateway team built it ourselves. We painstakingly converted all those RPCs to REST semantics, XSD schemas to almost JSON schema with Swagger. And we wrote all the controllers and converted the calls and transformed responses and made it all work. And we learned a lot doing that. And the biggest lesson we learned writing that first client-facing Web API Gateway team shouldn't be building Web API products. We don't scale, and we didn't have the business knowledge or understand the data in the way that the teams responsible for the business domains did. So if we wanted to offer our clients this broad selection of RESTful APIs for Bloomberg data, we needed to pivot. And we started working on building all the tools and processes to enable teams in different domains to we pivoted to building the tools and processes to allow the teams responsible for different business domains to build APIs. Again, not repeating things over and over again, every team that started a new API project shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. We'd already consolidated a lot of work in the gateway, but at that point, we also found an opportunity to leverage this launch of this new internal CI/CD app hosting environment. And we built a template for a Flask-based API service teams could launch with a few clicks. It integrated with the gateway for the routing and security, implemented all those required steps that were our policy but might be easy to skip over, used Flask RESTful to encourage resource-oriented paths. We extended open source documentation generation tools, and we used comments and decorators in the code to generate documentation and validate requests and responses. It was a big success. It's rare today to find a team working on an API project that's not built on this framework. A little bit of fast API coming in, probably might be the future, but today, that's what it is. It's got probably thousands of mentions and hundreds of repos internally. It's not perfect. We're going to get back to the documentation generation part in lessons learned later. But it enabled a lot of teams to get started on the API project more quickly, and without having to make a bunch of decisions and do a bunch of work for things every API service needs. So we had a good foundation for implementing web APIs on the technical side, but we still had a long way to go to make sure our clients were getting a consistent experience across all our APIs. And we wrote the first version of our REST API standards. We trained teams on how to use HTTP verbs semantically, the right response codes to return. We had guidelines on URL structures for endpoints, and we wrote schemas and examples for the bodies of error responses. And then we started requiring teams to come to us for that REST review before they publish their APIs. And we caught a lot of problems this way. Lots of REST anti-patterns that are easy to spot. Early on, lots of teams sneaking in RPC over HTTP instead of a RESTful API. It's easy to catch those glaring issues, but it's a lot harder to enforce good design with a review that's after the API has been implemented. Understandably, when a team is inside of their goal of launching the API worked on for many sprints, they're going to push back on that design, that review that criticizes the underlying design. I heard another talk earlier today says the team, pulls the "we release next week" card, and I've seen that card before. The tools we provided were helping teams generate thorough documentation for the APIs they developed, but it seemed like they weren't really looking at the documentation until it was time to get the API reviewed. So we realized we needed to encourage API specs to be written and reviewed much earlier in the process. But at that moment, we were also drowning in support work. Our gateway usage was growing rapidly, and at the time, every endpoint that we onboarded had to be entered in our gateway configuration manually by our team. And we had an engineer doing work like this almost full time. So like building APIs by ourselves, registering, maintaining gateway configuration by ourselves wasn't going to scale. We needed to provide self-service tools so teams could onboard themselves to the gateway. And since we also needed to encourage teams to generate their OpenAPI specs earlier, we decided to build our tools around specification. So we started with a script that read an OpenAPI JSON file and generated the SQL we needed to register all the endpoints. It was a POC for using the script, specs for registration, and it worked within our current manual processes. So we grew that into a web portal that could load the specification from a URL, validate it, register the endpoints, configure the gateway in the development environment to route to the endpoints, route those endpoints to the same server that hosted the spec. It still wasn't perfect. The spec didn't have to be good, but it did need to cover all the endpoints, and the team was aware of the spec before they started integrating with the gateway. So back to that principle to make the right things easy and the wrong things hard. If a team started with this OpenAPI specification, registering with the gateway was easy. If they didn't have a spec, registering was hard. And then we turn back to those standards. We realized we needed to go far beyond HTTP verbs, response codes, URL structures, and we realized we needed help. So we put together a group of interested engineers and project managers. And again, like I've heard from other people on these stages today, getting that group together consistently was the hardest part. But when we did, we came up with a long list of areas we thought our standards should and could cover. We decided to start small and address the questions that were of immediate concern to the individuals and teams participating. And then whenever someone would come to us with a, how do we do this question, we'd invite them to, come discuss it with the group, join the group, collaborate to figure it out. So with that process, we reached consensus and documented fields and views on APIs, versioning, pagination, content types, content negotiations. And we even developed a standard and an extension to OpenAPI for endpoints that returned service and events. Sorry. That allows us to document those subscriptions in our developer portal right alongside our REST APIs. I know that might be a bit controversial at this conference. We know about async API, and we're working toward enabling rich messaging and pub/sub API products on the platform. But at the time, we identified a business need, we found a pragmatic technical solution, and we worked together across teams to make it work in a consistent way. And we were able to leverage OpenAPI extensions to create a specification for documenting that in a way that our developer portal could portray to the customer. So, having standards written down to guide API designers was a great start, but education and training were also critical. So, about the same time, we started hosting periodic web API meetups to share and discuss what we were learning. Organizing events is also hard. It takes a lot of work, a lot of coordination, but it can also be really worth it. We haven't been quite as consistent with the meetups as we'd like, but the events we've had have all been valuable. We've had talks targeted for engineers, product managers, and business stakeholders. I think targeting all three of those groups has been really important because we're not just getting the engineers with technology, we're getting the product and the business with the whys and the justifications and the benefits to their organization for API standards and consistency. Members of our team have presented. We've hosted presenters from other teams to show off their innovations, and we've had some vendors come in and present training classes to the group. So, as we started focusing more on API standards, we realized we need to shift the paradigm for creating API products from a code-first approach to a design-first mindset. A few slides back, we talked about how teams would write or generate their spec basically last, after their code was done, way too late to have a meaningful conversation about the API design itself. We started requiring documentation earlier, but requiring a specification file doesn't guarantee an API will be designed well, or really doesn't guarantee it'll be designed at all. We provided an API service framework that encouraged organizing URLs around resources, but that doesn't enforce naming things consistently or using the right patterns for operations that don't map directly to a post or a put. Doesn't really even enforce using a post or a put the right way. So knowing that the best time to iterate on design is while you're designing, right? If your design deliverable is an OpenAPI specification, you can get your feedback and improve on the design before you start implementing all the code, business logic, controllers, et cetera. So at this point, we did several things to help move to a design-first approach. First off, we made tools available. We discovered teams were using a variety of tools to author OpenAPI. Everything from whatever their favorite code editor is to Swagger.io to who knows what else. So we selected an API, a vendor for an API design platform with collaboration and review. We introduced it via our meetups, our newsletters, our chats that we'd already established. And we started encouraging the teams to use it at the very beginning of their API product development. We moved those API reviews. The way I drew this slide, you can't tell it moved up because I added things to the thing. We moved API reviews to earlier in the onboarding process. And we encouraged teams to come to the Web API Gateway team or meetup even earlier to get inputs on their design. Basically said, if you come to us with your idea before you start your design, we can help you more than you come to us with a design. If you come to us with a design, we can help you more than if you come to us with code. I mentioned earlier, it's harder to enforce good design with a review after the API is implemented because the cost of change is higher the further along the development lifecycle of the project is. So yeah, we encourage teams to get feedback on their designs while they're still designs. At this point, we're trying to strike a balance between process and practices. We don't want this heavy blocking onerous process. We do want API developers to understand why adherence to standards and consistency across our API portfolio is valuable to all stakeholders. We do want to teach best practices to help us achieve those goals, and we do want to provide tools to make applying those practices easier. So, I'll take a quick detour that kind of ties in with that tours here. I want to share an example of something we're able to do for our clients that was enabled by the focus on good design and documentation. So, there are several API mocking services available that work with OpenAPI specs, often for testing and stuff. Since our client-facing APIs had good specs, and we already had a client portal with documentation based on those specs, we were able to expose mock API services and make that experience interactive. We did it such that all API products got this mock experience for free. The better your specification, the better the schemas, the examples, the better the mock experience for the clients. But if teams want to, they can provide a sandbox implementation that will route differently. And instead of replying with mock data from the spec, we'll actually route to the sandbox implementation. They can implement more advanced logic, more like the real thing, but still be isolated from sensitive production data in the developer portal. So teams that need the more complex behavior can get it, but there's a baseline mock behavior everyone gets just by having an OpenAPI spec. So over the last few years, Web API Gateway usage at Bloomberg has pretty much skyrocketed, and we found some of the limits of our technological and architectural design choices. So we've spent a lot of this year optimizing for speed, stability, and scale in the gateway itself. Right now, we're trying to push our gateway error rate down into inverse that, and get 5.9 successes. Get our slowest response times down like that low 2 millisecond range, low 2-digit millisecond range, not 2 milliseconds. That'll be amazing. And we're a small but growing team, so that's got most of our focus right now. But we're eagerly planning the next steps on our journey to improve API governance and create a consistent, holistic Web API experience for our customers. So I want to wrap up and talk about some of the ideas we are working on and how we're planning to keep applying these same principles that we followed in our journey so far. Don't repeat yourself and make doing the right things easy. I've started saying API platform a lot more often than API gateway because our organization and focus have shifted. We've teamed up with the group working on graph APIs, and together we're trying to build the next generation API experience for our clients. We've got big and exciting goals, but I want to focus on a few things that we want to do that will leverage OpenAPI specifications for that better developer and customer experience. Told you to remember this. Remember those documentation generation tools? They were really great when we asked teams to start building APIs, and they made it easy to get thorough documentation without a lot of thought or extra work. But we've learned that thought and extra work is really essential at the design stage to create a good API. And if our goal is a cohesive API design across multiple products, it's even more important. So engineering teams love to generate documentation, right? And our tools didn't just give them documentation. They provided input and output validation. So all the team had to do was import our library, add a few decorators. We made doing the right things hard and the wrong things easy. It's not the guideline. So there's been resistance to writing OpenAPI specs first. And part of that is if the teams want to keep using all the validation tools they're already using, they're going to have to re-implement their documentation as in their code annotations to use it. So we're going to deprecate and replace this tool. We're planning to provide libraries that provide compatible input and output validation with minimal code changes for existing users. And for new projects, we want to generate scaffolding that maps the controllers to the specs and invokes that validation automatically. Let's get back to making the right things easy. We want to start encouraging standardization and consistency, starting down at the data model level. Some of the businesses we were working with have already started some really impressive data modeling projects in their domains. And we want to align with them to integrate that catalog of data models they're building into our API design processes and expand the tools and make them available to any team that's building APIs. Enabling teams to apply DRY for data models and not reinvent new schemas for common concepts, et cetera. And we want to do the same thing with the common operations and the REST patterns people use to implement these things in their APIs. Those become the building blocks for OpenAPI and other specifications describing new API design. Then, with a process that composes OpenAPI specs from reusable components, we need to move toward treating OpenAPI specifications themselves as composable for our customers. Right now, if a customer consumes APIs from 3 different products, they get 3 different OpenAPI documents. And every team has to maintain those documents in a single place for each document, regardless of how their API services are structured. Our vision is to decouple the API documentation that teams write from the documents served to customers. We've already really done this for routing and permissions. The way teams set up their backend servers and code bases doesn't have to match the way endpoints are named and grouped and delivered to customers on the gateway. So we're just going to extend that to specifications. We'll probably need some new standards internally for things in the spec like tags, but there are other things in the spec like info, server, security. We can apply DRY on and fill in by the gateway or generate from things we already know. And then as we move the alignment of the OpenAPI documents from that customer product perspective to the team and service perspective, where the document defines the APIs coming from a service, we can move more configuration and metadata into the documentation. So we already get our paths and methods from the specification. But we can use the server object, and we could probably write some extensions to document configuration like service routings and authorization scopes and target gateways, allowing us to more tightly couple configuration with documentation as versions are promoted through the development to production pipeline, and better ensure that documentation matches endpoints that are registered and made available in every version and every environment. And give teams that one obvious place for that, single unambiguous authoritative representation of the configuration data for their API. So these initiatives will leverage OpenAPI specs and apply the principles we keep coming back to. We're going to make doing the right thing easy by updating our tools to discourage code-first workflows, reward teams that start with thorough OpenAPI specification. We want to help API designers keep dry by providing a set of building blocks for the common data models and operations. Leverage those composable API specifications to provide better client documentation experience, decoupled from backend architecture. And we want to help API owners keep their configuration dry by giving it a home in their version of API specs. Thanks. Got a few minutes. We have both. The portal I showed in here is the public-facing portal, or client-facing portal. It's gated, pass protected, but it's for clients. We have a lot of internal APIs, and we generally just use GitHub and other tools to share the specs on those. So, yeah. It's another goal I didn't put on here is the internal API catalog was probably something we need.
What was the sponsorship history behind the whole program? Was it like CIO first and then the business came at some point, or like that it never changed?
Kind of came out of one business unit, and then
one business unit, yes.
Yeah, and then grew and got CTO support, and then other teams started using it, and kind of grew organically. I think from there, more or less. So.
Was the business involved at some point as an owner?
Yes. The API gateway itself, the initiative to build consumer-facing web APIs was a business initiative within one Bloomberg business. We have lots of businesses that, I think that's right. Is that right? I don't know if you. None of us who are here now, but web APIs were here that year. So, yeah. Cool. Anything else? Yeah, thank y'all.